of our initial event. We are so happy to have Pastor Kaari Reierson here to lead us today. Just a quick overview. On the tables are the same pamphlets that we had last time. So if you didn't get a chance to grab one of them, please do. Those are all different pamphlets that Pastor Allison got for us. And then there's also a stack of white scratch paper and a pen or a couple of pens at each table. That's in case anybody has any questions or comments or concerns that you want to let our team, myself, Chad, Luke, and Molly know, things that you want to cover in the next couple of months, questions you have. There is always the basket that's out in the hallway there where you can leave any anonymous comments if you'd like, but today we thought we'd make it easier and just put it on the table in front of you. So Chad is going to speak with us, give us a little bit of the history of RIC and our church, and then he will introduce Pastor Reierson, and then we'll take questions afterwards. We've got bagels and fizzy water if anybody wants some, and special cream cheese that Chad brought, so go ahead and dig in. And without further ado, Chad.
Thank you. Good morning. For those of you who don't remember me, I'm Chad Johnson. I think of you all the time. I haven't forgotten you. For better or worse, found a job that I love. Unfortunately, I work on Sundays. So if you could have church on Tuesday, it'd be ideal. So I wanted to talk for a minute about how did we get to the point where we are ready to become an RIC congregation. The journey really started for me and then for St. John's in the early 2000s in the pool at Northwestern, where I met Kaari Reierson. I aspired to be a swimmer, so I was swimming on master's team, and I met Kaari there. Kind of concurrently, I had started on the path to leadership at St. John's. I joined the council, and very shortly thereafter found myself president of the congregation. And at my first Synod Assembly, one of the topics that started to emerge was the notion of how we as a denomination would address the idea of ordaining LGBTQ clergy, and would we recognize or perform same-sex unifications and blessings. Same-sex marriage was not yet legal in the state or in the country, so it was a topic we discussed, and I went to a session on it at Synod Assembly. It was in Kenosha at Carthage at the time, with some of you may remember the late Joyce Shumway, and it wasn't even something we had really thought about, but what really captivated me was this was just presented as a matter of civil rights and fairness. And I believe what somebody said in it was, if God created me in his image and I am good, if I am gay, why am I not good? And then that to me was a really powerful argument, and I thought about that. I think at one point I chatted with Kaari about that, and Kaari at the time was working on the statement on human sexuality at the ELCA. She eventually asked me to help bring that motion forward at the Synod Assembly, and we also brought that forward at St. John's. And it was, I believe, 2007, 2008 that these discussions took place. And we as a congregation did ultimately vote that we were in agreement with the ELCA that we would support the idea of having LGBTQ clergy and performing same-sex unifications at St. John's. Not without controversy. Somebody did back me into the corner in the narthex and tell me I was going to hell for this. I don't think so. I think this is the right thing to do because we are all God's people and we are all equal. And I still hold that. And later became policy in the ELCA that we would in fact go forward and have gay clergy. We, as a denomination, freely marry gay couples. And today, we're kind of at the final step in the journey where we're going through the educational process and discussions to get ourselves certified as a Reconciled in Christ congregation. What that means is we go through the process in education and discussion to make sure we're all comfortable with it, we understand it, we develop a statement of welcome to anyone who wants to come to St. John's, however they want to come to St. John's, welcoming them as gay folks. So that's how we are today. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Kaari, who will take it from there.
Thanks, Tad.
Yeah.
First of all, it's lovely to be here. Congratulations to all of you. As a middle-aged, white, straight, cisgender, she, her, hers, heteronormative pastor, I can tell you that if I was looking at congregations, I would probably prefer an RIC congregation over a non-RIC congregation. It just kind of says something about where the congregation is. So I think this is a good thing for you and your future. A little bit about my background. I was a classics major in college. So my undergraduate degree is about understanding and interpreting text. And text and language and context and history are very important to me. And understanding a text is very important to me. So I come at preaching and this with that background and understanding. So that's kind of my take and angle on it. That's my education on it, and that's my personal affinity is to want to really understand language and intent. So a little bit about the so-called Clobber passages. I'd like to start with kind of a broad framing. Oh, and I almost forgot to mention, my congregation, Grace in Evanston, I was looking back at my notes, trying to remember when exactly we did this, and it was just about 20 years ago. And I took most of my material, because honestly, it's been 20 years since I really thought about this deeply, and I took most of my material from the Journey Together Faithfully, Part 2, publication of the ELCA. It was a Bible study that the ELCA issued in the process. And what they tried to do was say, like, here are the texts, here are how some people think about the text, here about other people think about the text, here's what we can tell you from what we know about the texts. So it was kind of an attempt, not even to be persuasive, but just to kind of help people understand where others are coming from. So into the kind of general framework. I would like you to first understand that biblical literalism is literally impossible. The Bible is a selection of ancient texts which form community and impart meaning and understanding, but it is not a rule book, and the Bible is not fully consistent. And the members of the Council of Nicaea who selected these particular books about the Jewish teachings and the life of Jesus of Nazareth knew that the Bible was not entirely consistent in closing the canon, and they did it anyway. They chose these books because they think they are important. Another thing for us to keep in mind, Martin Luther was also not a biblical literalist. What he says about the Bible is the cradle that bears Christ to us. Martin Luther himself was a Hebrew Bible scholar. He detested the letter of James, calling it a right straw epistle because it didn't fit very well with his notion of justification. So if people really, really want to be biblical literalists, it's going to be a lot of work and a lot of mental gymnastics, and it really doesn't form community. It doesn't further faith. It's a certain kind of way of thinking that's kind of inconsistent with our tradition. The way we do think about kind of rules around behavior in the Bible is this. Invited to answer the question, teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? Jesus answered, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbors as your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and prophets. So that's Matthew 22. And that's how the ELC started its sexuality studies document. This is the lens through which we understand Scripture. This is the lens through which we understand what God is telling us about how we treat each other. So getting into the texts, before I get too far, I want to note that the Bible is a lot of pages. It's a very long book. It's a very dense book. And there is very little in it about homosexuality. There's a lot in it about how, like, God is coming for the wealthy, powerful people with God's wrath, and people don't seem overly concerned about that. So we have spent over history a lot of time on sexuality that's perhaps out of order of magnitude for how much it concerned the writers of the Hebrew Bible and New Testament and Greek and the Gospels and the Epistles. So, things I want to talk about with regard to each verse, or think about literary context. What kind of literature, when you encounter something in the Bible, what kind of literature is this? Is it an epistle to be read aloud to a particular community that is struggling with a particular issue, and St. Paul is trying to help them stay together and form community, and perhaps even struggle with, like, the Roman occupation? Is it a hymn? Is it a parable? Is it a gospel narrative about the birth of Jesus? Is it a narrative about the hopes of the people of Israel? What are the choices the author of the text makes in conveying meaning? What gets left out and what gets stayed in? All these things are important when you are reading something like the Bible that is ancient, and that we don't understand just by reading it. You heard me talk about the parables. I don't know anything about growing wheat and weeds. I don't know anything about shepherding either. I do bake bread, but not a whole lot. So there's a lot of it that the ancient hearers would understand that we would not necessarily understand without doing some exploration of the context. So historical context is important. Sorry, literary context is important. Also historical context. To whom is this addressed? What was their understanding of the world? What were they going through at the time that they needed to hear this word? What was important to their sense of meaning and purpose? And for us, who translated these words? They were not written in English. Ancient Hebrew, by the way, super difficult to translate. Very little in the way of punctuation, no vowels, very difficult to translate. What was the worldview of the people who translated this for us? Most translations are translated by a collection of biblical scholars, which, in case of the NRSV, which is kind of the standard, the New Revised Standard Version, there's now an updated version, it was translated mostly by older white men. That's who was biblical scholars 30 plus years ago. 30 was translated right before I graduated from college, so 23, yeah, it's like 34 years ago. Any questions first? Any questions now about kind of setting context and thinking about things in terms of context?
What were they translating it from? The original Greek and...
Right. Yeah. So the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible is written in ancient Hebrew, not modern Hebrew, ancient Hebrew. It's keep in mind, like, these things are written down years after they happened. This isn't like a newspaper account of Jesus of Nazareth. It's the stories that the community told to each other, and they wrote down because they said, this is important. So everything is written down years after the fact, and then the New Testament is written in Koine Greek, which was the kind of lingua franca of the Greek part of the Roman civilization. What's the word? The Roman Empire. So it's a very kind of simplified Greek. It's not Attic Greek, which is very complex and kind of difficult to translate. Koine Greek is actually, I learned it like in the summer, so you do not learn Attic Greek in the summer. So Those are the two languages. And then the Hebrew Bible and New Testament were translated into Latin, which is called the Vulgate. And you might know that Martin Luther was an advocate of education and translated the Bible into German, which absolutely tore the Western Europe apart because it was thought that the church should be interpreting the Bible, not individual users should not be reading and interpreting the Bible. And so a little bit they were not like wrong about they weren't right about that, but it was a sea change to have individuals actually have access to the words on the page. Is that a good answer to your question?
But they were going back to as far as they could to the original text. I mean,
yes.
Okay.
The original text as written by, obviously the stories about Moses are written down hundreds of years. And the Hebrew Bible is, as we do research, we think, okay, it's composed of the works of several different writers and then compiled into, one book. That's why we have like 2 creation stories in Genesis. When we, as we do like textual criticism, we realize like how complicated this is like a living document, right? It's not something one person sat down and wrote down at one time. It's something that developed over hundreds of years in a community, and finally somebody wrote it down. And then it got copied, right, by monastics, and monastics sometimes make mistakes because they're copying all this stuff. So then there are some inconsistencies even in ancient texts, especially in the Hebrew Bible. I don't think it's too bad in the New Testament, but that's not really my specialty. How's that? Okay. All right. Going on to the Clobber passages. Sometimes people mention the creation story as evidence somehow that God created 2 genders, and that's like literally the only time that biblical literalists try and interpret a story. Like I don't think you get a whole framework around which to build a society based on reading into the story that in the Hebrew Bible it says God created male and female. That's kind of like, reading into that one creation story while females are subordinate to males because female was created out of male. Like it takes a lot of imagination to get there. So it's not generally considered one of the Clobber passages, but that's more an indication of your own worldview that you are bringing to the story than what is in the story. So if it's okay with everyone, I'll move on to what's like traditionally the Clobber passages. The first one is Genesis 19, 1 through 38, and that's the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's a good example of how when we read a story with our modern sensibility and modern sensitivities, we bring some assumptions to the story and we kind of miss the point of the story as told in ancient times. So it's a kind of like, but did you enjoy the play, Mrs. Lincoln moment? Like this is the story about ancient hospitality in which two angels are visiting and they are threatened, and the host, and they come to the host's house and say, bring these men out. And this is a story about hospitality with a subtext or a subplot of sexual violence. Yes, they threatened to rape the male guests. And then, and no one ever talks about this, the host offers to allow the marauders to rape his own daughters in exchange. Not because that's better, but because he is a host and he is trying to protect his guests. Because in biblical times, hospitality was incredibly important, especially to Jewish people. When the world is hostile, you are trying to create community and keep each other together. Ask yourself, is one kind of rape worse than the other? All acts of sexual violence are wrong, but somehow we have decided that this passage is about homosexuality. But no one ever said that homosexual rape was okay. Just like heterosexual rape is not okay. Sexual violence is wrong. And that's really the subplot of this. The major plot is this is a story about hospitality and what it means when people don't respect hospitality or threaten the angels. There's more than one story in the Bible of when angels, God's messengers, are treated badly, and what that does to the community. That's what the story is about. To say that this is a condemnation of homosexuality, I'm like, well, I guess you could say it's a condemnation of homosexual rape, but no one ever said that was okay. So this doesn't really necessarily pertain to what we're concerned about, I think. Any questions on that particular story? Okay. Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13, both saying, if a man lies with a male with a woman is an abomination. This is in the context here. Again, context is important. Is a series of purity laws relating to sexuality. So I've always kind of wondered, like, we assume we know what that means, but what exactly does it mean? I mean, no one ever says, like, well, what exactly does that mean? Because we don't actually talk about that. And I'm just going to put that out there. But as far as the context, the first part of Leviticus is mostly about who in a family can have sex with whom, mostly about the women. The upshot is that it's preserving the safety of vulnerable women so that their male relatives don't take advantage of them. Because for the Jewish people, genetics is very important, right? And they want to know that, like, women are pure and women are only producing Jewish people with their husbands. And so this is a way of protecting people who are very vulnerable in society. The relationships that are forbidden are the ones where there is an unequal power dynamic. And in that time it was written, men were not allowed to be in or envisioned to be in sharing in safe, loving relationships. Are we really going to refuse considering historical context or textual context and maintain this as an absolute prohibition against men having sex with men? Because is it really talking about the same thing? Are we talking about the many same-gender couples in my congregation in Grace? I don't think there's an unequal power dynamic. It's an incredible, loving, committed, nurturing relationship. So there are two issues with that. First of all is we actually don't know exactly what that means. If you're going to be literalist about it, you have to say, well, what do you think that means for a man to lie with another man as one? We assume we know what it means, but we don't know for sure. And second of all, it's about a certain kind of relationship, a certain kind of societal arrangement more than physically what is happening. But if you're still going to go in that direction, if you're going to refuse to consider historical context or textual context, what are you going to do about the rest of Leviticus? Do you eat pork or bacon? Have you ever sold land? Have you ever worked on the Sabbath? Ask yourself why this is the one thing that we are taking seriously out of all of Leviticus. There's a lot in there. You can't play football because that's made of pigskin. Like, try and put it in the context of like everything that's there, and ask yourself why this one thing is the thing we focus in on. As a side note, ladies, we are all still in the clear. No one yet has said anything about women. So I'm just gonna note that. Moving on, yes. I know you were moving on, but.
Could you go back to the unequal power dynamic?
Yeah.
Because I'm not understanding how that would be, I just need to hear it.
Right, sure. So these purity laws are enacted against a prohibition against women who kind of had no power to say no to men who wanted sexual relations with them. So it's setting up a structure in which a man cannot take advantage of his brother's wife. She can say it is against purity laws for you to demand this from me. So that's one kind of relationship where this is trying to protect people who can't say no. from people who have the social power to force them to do it. So in that context, you know, I would read this to say, like, somebody who has control, a man who has control of another man should not be demanding things from that man sexually, because that's not the kind of relationship that we want to foster. Does that make more sense now?
Thank you.
Okay, sure. Any other questions about the Hebrew Bible? Because apparently I've covered the Hebrew Bible. Leviticus it's in two places and it's very similar. And again, ladies, we're all still good. So moving on to Pauline letters. And this is where, you know, there's nothing in the Gospels that you can read literally and say, well, this says, you know, Jesus was against homosexuality. Jesus had lots of other things to talk about. It's nothing that people are really, you have to work pretty hard to make that happen. There's a passage about divorce that people sometimes use, but it's just so much work to make that and try and apply. It's a lot of mental gymnastics. But I'd like to talk about 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 11. Or 1 Corinthians 6, 9. Do you not know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, male prostitutes, sodomites. And that goes with 1 Timothy 1, 9 through 10. Paul's condemnation of the Greek term malakoi, which refers to softness. Fornicators, sodomites, slave traders, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to the sound teaching. So Paul's condemnation of the Greek term, and I took Greek 25 years ago one summer, aresnokoiti, is a word that Paul is usually translated as fornicators. It's a word that Paul essentially made up. It's not found anywhere else in the Bible. They're not exactly sure what he means. It's clearly referring to like males having sex with males in some way from like the two component parts of the world. Modern scholars, again, have questions. Are the relationships in the ancient world that he's talking about the ones that we are talking about as well? Scholars have mostly argued that those relationships that he was talking about were transactional and economically oppressive. He's talking about male temple prostitution. So is he talking about like two people who've been together for 35 years and are raising children and are like coming to church? And no, he's talking about like a one-night stand with like some, you know, homeless teenage boy who's working as a temple prostitute. You know, are we really going to lump those two things in the same jumble? These two texts go together. I'm just going to read from the Journey Together Faithfully. The precise meaning of the two Greek words in 1 Corinthians, translated in the NRSV as male prostitutes and sodomites, one of which occurs in Timothy 1:10, has been disputed by biblical scholars. The terms have been variously translated. So we don't know exactly what Paul meant because there's no other instance of this word in the Bible or in the ancient world. We're kind of inferring that's what he meant. So again, like we are bringing our inference to this text and making a decision about what it means. And so we've decided that refers to all men having sex with all men, but that's our decision. That's something that we are imposing on an ancient text that we don't really know. And again, ladies, still nothing that applies to us. Moving on to the last one, actually, Romans 1:26 to 27. Paul's word about exchanging natural for unnatural relations. This is the one where I'd say, yeah, Paul is somewhat specific here. Like this is actually something where like you could maybe get some traction here. And here's what it says: for this reason, God gave them over to dishonorable passions. Their females exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, And in the same way, also the males, giving up natural intercourse with females, were consumed with their passionate desires for one another. Males committed shameless acts with males and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error. This is probably the only passage that's really about sex. Or is it? I mean, it's the only one that includes anything at all about women. It's not clear what women are doing when they are exchanging natural intercourse for unnatural. What does that mean? Like, oral sex? No sex. Sex with each other? I don't know. I mean, we assume it's sex with each other. But again, we are bringing something to the text that's not explicitly elaborated in the text. But in any case, there's a clear assumption that underlies this passage that there is like a natural way to have sex and an unnatural way to have sex. So, like, okay, there are no kids in the room. I'm going to tell you something. When I had my first child and I was looking for diaper services in the area, what I found instead was that there's a whole culture of adults who find it sexually stimulating to wear diapers. I had no idea that this happened. And I just was like, wow, I didn't know that was a thing. There are a lot of flavors of sexual activity out there, a lot of flavors of heterosexual activity out there. And some of it is harmless and life-giving, and some of it is not harmless, and some of it is life-taking. Is the gender of the people involved the determining factor of the harmlessness or not harmlessness? I think that's something that we really need to think about. Do we just say, because it happened between a married man and a married woman who are married to each other, it's all okay? Because remember, marital rape was not a law on the books until after I was born. And it wasn't, disallowed in Britain for a long time. So we still are struggling with what natural versus unnatural means and what life-giving versus not life-giving means. We have not figured that out. What's the point of the story that Paul is telling? Clearly, there's some underlying assumption, but is the point to circumscribe sexual activity? Or, if you know of the context of the Romans that the Roman community is living in, is it to tell a cautionary tale about people who began idol worship instead of worshiping with the early Christian community? It's an underlying assumption Paul has, but Paul has all sorts of underlying assumptions that are true about the ancient world that are not true today. That's what I have, particular to the historical and literary context of all the texts. All of the texts that we talk about homosexuality in the Bible, I think I just covered in like 15 minutes, right? So think about everything that's in the Bible and think about how for centuries we have been focusing in on these texts to the exclusion of wondering how to make all relationships life-giving and harmless. And like in the meantime, we allowed women to be raped in their marriages until in the last 40 years. Think about, so never mind all the harm that we've done to people who are homosexual. Think about all the harm we've allowed to happen to people who are heterosexual, mostly women, about choosing the wrong thing to focus on. So that's pretty much the way I'm feeling 20 years out from this biblical study. That sure, if you wanted to make Romans about that, I guess you could. If you just decided to extract it from its historical context of Paul being concerned about people involved in temple prostitution and idol worshipers, I guess you could say. But is that really how you want to spend your time? Is that God's word of grace to you today? That's what I'd like you to think about. Thanks. Any more questions? Yes.
So, how does the Bible interpret marriage? I thought through Genesis and Matthew, marriage, it seems pretty clear between a man and a woman. The man leaves his mother and father, and he goes to his wife, and gets married.
Right, well, in the Hebrew Bible, it's between like one man and many women. Right? I mean, it's it's a New Testament construct of like one, the Hebrew Bible allows men to have like 12 wives. So I don't think you can, but yes, the passage, so that's the passage about divorce that I was talking about. And people say like, well, what is Jesus getting at there? And again, he's trying to in historical context, he's trying to prevent women from being summarily divorced by their husbands under Jewish law and then abandoned socially. Because if you're a divorced woman at that time, you now have kids that you are probably taking care of, you have no way to earn money, you are sent back to your family in disgrace. So the context of that is for Jesus not wanting for Jewish men to just divorce their wives on a whim, because they could at that point. So that's because, in the Hebrew Bible, Abraham had like a lot of wives. We know that. So that's something that we're kind of, again, like context is important, right? Like what's the intent of that? And it was actually to protect women. It was a pretty bold move on the part of Jesus to say like, you can't just divorce women because, whatever, she had a kid and she got fat. You can't do that anymore. So yeah.
What was the last passage again? I missed that. Was it Paul something?
Romans 1:26 to 27. And this is, if you want to look up this study, I think it was ELCA Journey Together Faithfully Part 2, and I can find the link and give it to Pastor Allison. And it tries to lay out in a kind of, most studies that are written at this point are not trying to kind of be impartial. But that study at that point was trying to was to get people to hear each other and hear saying, some people say this and some people say this. This is why people feel this way and this is why other people feel differently. So that might be, a good place to look if you're thinking about like, well, where would I fall on this if I'm not really sure? You could find some echoing of thoughts in there probably. But I don't have it. The link is super long and goofy, but it's still up there. Thank goodness, because I was like, I'm gonna have to dig in my files to find this. If I don't have it, I'm gonna have to dig in my files to find this. It's gonna be painful.
If you could give that to Pastor Allison,
Yes.
and she can pass it out if
Okay,
anyone
I'm
wants
happy
it.
to do that.
You.
And another thing, so I was, my kids went to North Shore Country Day for a while, and I did like parent education for years. And we like issues around like gender, like I'm like too old, like this is like totally jump. For me, I'm like issues around gender, I'm like, what? So I'm not, like I don't feel very in the know at all. But we brought someone to talk about like gender and kids to the school. And, it makes me a little like, whoa. But what I realized in bringing that person was like only a couple people showed up. But for those couple of people who showed up, it was life-giving and life-changing. Like most people, it just doesn't really matter, right? There's this story about like fish who are swimming to work, and one fish says, there are three of them, one fish says, passing the other way, says to one of them, hey, how's the water today? And he goes, oh, it's great. And then the two fish keep swimming, and the third fish says to the second fish, what's water? Like, nobody asked me, like people asked me plenty of like annoying bad stuff. It was not fun being a woman in the candidacy process in the ELCA 30 years ago. But there were lots of stuff I didn't have to do because I was straight. Or at least I could present as straight, I don't know. Like, yeah, first question that Synod asked me was, what are your plans for marriage? I was like, I'm like 23. Like, what? I don't know. So that's what, so again, like they were focusing in on what's your plan for marriage rather than are you suited to be a minister? Are you called by God to be a minister? Like but for getting back to my original point, for people for whom this matters, for people who don't have gills, this is life-changing. And maybe you do it for the person who doesn't have gills. Like, it turns out that you can still swim, but you're giving somebody else the ability to be in community with you. And so that's what the choice that you're making. And for younger people, it's a very big change in the way of thinking for older people. It's really tough. And the church allowed that way of thinking to continue. They allowed people to think that this is like the cornerstone of our faith. But is the cornerstone of your faith this kind of marriage, or is the cornerstone of your faith like a crucified and risen Christ? I hope it's a crucified and risen Christ. But I'm very sad for people for whom this is like so incredibly difficult, because their faith has not been nurtured in a way to say, like, actually, I can still be a Christian and be okay with gay marriage. Yes?
So, you talked a lot about same-sex relationships and how those are interpreted. Are there biblical passages that have to do with gender fluidity and?
Ooh, I warned Pastor Ellison, I was like, this is not my jam, because we weren't thinking about this like 20 years ago when I was going through this. I mean, you know, there's probably just like this assumption that people don't kind of cross traditional genders in the ancient world, but I'm sure there were, if you look at it with a lens, you're like, oh yeah, there's, even in the most ancient cultures, there are people who are kind of transgressing gender norms. I read a great book for a book club, I can never come up with the name of it. It talked about like ancient cultures, like shamans were considered kind of intersex, and so, but is it a big concern of the Bible? No, like people are trying to survive, they're not really thinking about it, but this is like not my area of expertise, so I'm gonna say I'm not the best person to ask about this. I'm just gonna own my ignorance, I'm sorry. I was hoping nobody would ask, so that I wouldn't be like, yeah, I know it's out there, I know people are talking about it, it's just not like what I was thinking about or studying 20 years ago. So anyway, yeah.
When it comes to the RIC process, has that evolved to be inclusive of gender identity?
You know, since we went through it 20 years ago, I assume so.
From everything I've read from the reconciling works, it's now including race and gender identity, and it's just the umbrella is growing and growing and growing.
The big answer, kind of like what we've studied as a group, is yes, it includes gender, it includes race. You know, we're a big umbrella as Christians. All are welcome. Whether you are fluid in your gender or you are rock solid in your gender, doesn't matter. You know, you are all welcome as an RC congregation. There are no exceptions, and that, you know, it's challenging to sometimes get there. Yeah.
That might be the answer, but I just wanted to hear it.
Yeah.
They do sort of, well, they try and like label and nail everything down in these pamphlets to the point where like my kids in their 20s were like laughing at it. They were like, I have no idea what you're talking about.
It's a lot. It can be a lot, right? You're like coming from this environment where no one's talking about that, and what? Yeah. And I mean, the way we did it at Grace was we wrote a statement, and so you kind of signal what you're thinking about as you write the statement, and then you revise it every like 5 years ago. Like, here's where we are. Here's where we are now. So
Yeah, and we're in the early stages of putting our statement together, and in coming weeks, I think we'll have a session where we share that statement and we all kind of adjust it to see what we as a group are feeling.
Right, because what we're gonna do when we get to June is vote on it, so we want everybody's input. We'll come up with sort of a skeleton one, and then you guys will add to it and we'll tweak it, and then we'll have a shiny project finish in June, that's our hope.
and again, like there's maybe nobody who's gender fluid or even thinking about it in the congregation, but maybe there's somebody whose child or grandchild is thinking about it, and just knowing about it could be life-saving for that person. So, but you might think at this point that's not a concern for me or our congregation.
I appreciate your point about life-saving, because it seems like there's been a lot of conversation around suicide rates and people who are feeling excluded to an extreme and really struggling.
Right. Right. I mean, and, you know, Jesus liked to minister at the margins. Like, that's kind of what we're supposed to be doing. Susan, you've been, I'm sorry, you've
Well,
been.
I just feel that we have a lot of hard work to do for our generation to get on board. But I talk to my grandchildren and they go, what?
Yeah.
Why? Why are you saying that? And my daughter has been just wonderful with going along with her son. And I mean, he just, anytime she makes some kind of comment about gender fluidity, he's had kids over to the house and she can't tell whether they're male or female. And she'll ask him, you know, are they male or female? He goes, I don't know, Mom, what is the matter? I mean, you know, I just think that we're gonna pass on, and the next generation is gonna be very different.
And I went through you wearing like work boots. I had two brothers. I wore dresses first. Then I was like not that interested in dresses. I wore work boots for a year, and then I came back to dresses. And kids go through, they're finding their identity, and they're like trying things on, and like doesn't mean they're nailed down into one thing, because today, you know, my hair was long, and tomorrow it might be short, and I don't know, but just don't freak out, right? Like. Anything else? Are we good?
Well, thanks for coming, everybody. We'll do this again. The next thing on the list is March 5th. Pastor L is going to be here, and she will be preaching and she will be talking in here. We'll find the topics and let you all know that. But please write anything on the comment cards. Let us know. We're here to help. And thank you so much for coming.
Sure. Thank you.